Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about nesting control structures. And the idea is that we're going to combine some of our selection statements together to make more complex decision-making structures. And generally speaking, you can combine all of our structures that we're going to study, both in this chapter and in next chapter, the iteration chapter, and you can end up doing some pretty complex things by snapping these pieces together, so to speak. Okay, so control structures can be combined to make more complicated decision-making constructs, just like I said. The reason we can do this is because the statements that are inside the bodies of the control structures can be anything at all in processing, including other control structures. So in other words, the body of an if statement can be another if, or it could be a switch, or could be a while loop or a for loop, which are topics that we'll talk about in the next chapter. So we can put these things together. A couple of things that are very important before we start into our discussion of this, and these are just sort of practical concerns. First of all, when you're writing your code, watch your indentation. Processing will try to suggest some indentation for you, and you should, generally speaking, follow its suggestions. But if you get mixed up and your code gets a little off in terms of its indentation, do your auto format before you turn your code in. Okay, that will help you make sure that your decision-making structures are readable and understandable. It's also a way to make sure you can tell when you've got things that are out of whack in terms of brackets. If your curly brackets are mismatched, doing an auto format will sometimes show you where that's happening. Lastly, as a practical matter, comment the ending bracket of each block when you put it in. So open the curly bracket, close it, slap a comment on the end, and that will help you keep track of which bracket goes with which structure. Because as you'll see when we start working on our example in the next video, the levels of indentation can get sort of extreme, and you can have lots of brackets. And so if you put a comment on all the ending ones, they're easier to keep track of. All right, we're going to focus on if statements here. And in particular, we're going to look at two different ways to combine if statements in order to make more complicated decisions. The first one that we'll look at is a proper nested if statement. So this is a flowchart that's reproduced from the book, and it involves three different Boolean expressions. We're going to call those expressions A, B, and C. Okay? So when we flow into this structure, decision A, or expression A, is the one that's evaluated first. And if it's true, which we're using the green color to represent, then we'll take the true branch of that if statement, but that in itself is another if. It's going to evaluate this expression C. So if the second if, which is nested in the true part of this if, is also true, then statement number 4 is the one that is executed. Okay? On the other hand, if we come in here, evaluate A to true, but C is false, which we'll represent with the red color, then statement number 3 is the one that is executed. Okay? Now on the other hand, what if our initial decision, or initial expression was false? Then that takes us to the left side of this diagram, which is another if statement using the expression B. Okay, so if that one is true, then statement 2 will be the one that's executed. On the other hand, if B is also false, oh, I thought I had a diagram there. If B is also false, then statement number 1 would be the one that's executed. Now let's look at a table that summarizes those. Okay? If you match this table up against the flowchart in the previous slides, you'll see that A and B come into play for statements 1 and 2, but C, that expression, is never evaluated. On the other hand, for the right-hand side of that diagram, A and C are the ones that matter, and the value of B doesn't matter. Okay, so we can make a truth table that shows us the outcome for that nested if statement. Now let's take a look at what that would look like in code. All right, and this is a skeleton that represents that flowchart that we just looked at. So if A is true, then we're going to the right-hand side of the flowchart, the true statements, and the body of this is actually another if. So if C is also true, then statement 4 would be the one that would be executed. Otherwise, if C is false, statement 3 is what would happen. And notice my comment here on the closing curly bracket for the C if. That helps me separate it from this curly bracket, which belongs to the first part of the A if statement. Okay? Our false area for the outer if, or the A if statement, is the left-hand side of that flowchart. In that case, if B is true, then statement 2 would execute. Otherwise, statement 1 would execute. And this ends the B if, and then finally this bracket corresponds to the outer if statement. In our example, the 4-song MP3 player that we'll look at in the next video will have a nested if structure to examine. Now, another way that we can combine if statements is with multiple or chained if statements. And so in this case, what we're going to do is just have a series of if statements, one right after the other. And we'll see which one of them is true and execute the corresponding statement. So this ends up looking a little bit like a switch. The difference is that we ask a series of true-false questions instead of one multiple choice question. Okay? So in this structure, we flow in, we see if A is true, and if it is, statement 1 would be executed. On the other hand, if A was false, then we would go and evaluate the second if statement, and if that's true, then statement 2 would execute. But if both A and B were false, we'd evaluate C, and if that's true, statement 3 would execute. And if it turned out that all 3 of A, B, and C were false, then statement 4, which is roughly our default condition, would execute. Okay? So here's what this looks like in code. Notice how we don't have anything inside the true body of the if involving statement A. Rather, our next if statement follows as the else part of the first one. So if A is true, we'll execute statement 1. Else if B is true, do statement 2. Else if C is true, do statement 3. And then else, this is if none of the above is true, then statement 4 would execute. Okay? And each of these, obviously, statement 1, 2, 3, and 4, could be multiple statements. But whatever they are, they would be executed according to the values of A, B, and C. All right? So we're going to move on then in our next video and look at using some complicated if structures to make more complicated decisions.